And good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be. I'm Pete Peterson, Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, coming to you live here from Malibu, California, and welcoming you here to the first in a new series of webinars called The Quest for Community, a Future for American Conservatism. This series of webinars comes out of an initiative here at the Graduate Policy School called the American Project, which was launched in early 2017 following the historic presidential election of 2016 to explore the future of the conservative movement. In our first gathering on our Malibu campus in June of 2017, we brought together a diverse group of academics, activists, policymakers to look at not only the past, but the future of American conservatism, to look at some of the trends. And what we resolved on was a theme that we call a conservatism of connection, understanding that we are entering and have been in a period of alienation and radical individualism. We concluded across this group that a reimagined, rejuvenated, understood conservatism of connection, or a communitarian conservatism, would be a way forward for the conservative movement. We outline the specifics of this view in a 4-page principles document called A Way Forward. All of the work of the American Project through events that we've hosted both here in Malibu and back in Washington, D.C., as well as our essay series that we've contributed to the website and our host Real Clear Policy, are at our own website, which is at publicpolicy.pepperdine.edu. And if you scroll down that homepage, you'll see the link for the American Project. If this is your first time in learning about the American Project, we welcome you and would love to get you involved in our work to promote this at once long-held view, but what we believe is a very relevant view, perspective on the American conservative movement. This, as I said, is the first of a series of webinars that we're going to be hosting. This first one here, we're delighted to welcome Ross Douthat, Gracie Olmstead to this discussion. So you know, we are planning a series of 5 webinars over the course of the next few months. This one will explore issues of political philosophy, as well as the current state of American politics, how a conservative or a communitarian conservatism could be relevant in an age of social distancing and social upheaval. But so you know, future webinars will explore issues about how the conservative movement came to this place, how we got here, but also issues of public policy, the relevance of a communitarian conservatism to issues of race, as well as other elements of public and even foreign policy. It would be hard to believe that this is your first time on Zoom, but if it is, again, we ask you to mute your microphones. The agenda for today is that we are going to begin with comments from Ross. Gracie is going to respond. I'll facilitate a brief conversation between the two of them. And we want this to be interactive. So we welcome your questions, which we'll get to towards the end of this session. Questions can be entered through the chat feature, which you'll find down at the bottom of your screen. You can feel free to ask questions, type them in at any time during this conversation, but just know that we'll be getting to those questions towards the end of our time together. You all know Ross, but to give his due background, he is a columnist for the New York Times, and his column appears every Tuesday and Sunday at the Times. He co-hosts the Times op-ed podcast, The Argument. He is the author, most recently, of The Decadent Society, published back in March I was delighted to partner with our friends in Washington, D.C. at the Trinity Forum to host a great conversation with Ross about that book. I know that video is up on both our YouTube page as well as the Trinity Forums. If you are not familiar with that book, really very relevant to today's conversation. And he is the film critic at the National Review. Gracie Olmstead is a writer for The American Conservative, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, among others. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Uprooted: Recovering the Legacy of the Places We've Left Behind, which will be published, we hope, after a vaccine has been deployed in March of 2021. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share, welcome you all here into my office before we turn it over to Ross to begin today's conversation. Ross?
Thank you, Pete, so much. I'm sorry, I just had to unmute myself. Thanks to Gracie for joining me for this conversation. And thanks to all of you for logging in whatever time zone you find yourself in. And Pete and I discussed this event actually at the last event that we did together, which he just kindly mentioned. And that was, I think, the last public event that I did before the pandemic thrust us all into our exciting Zoom existence. And at that time, we were sort of confidently chatting about how everything would be back to normal by mid-July. And, you know, we would be frolicking on the beaches that I'm told are adjacent to the Pepperdine campus. Sadly, instead, as you can see, I'm in my attic, which is, you know, almost as nice as Southern California. But it really is a pleasure to do this. So I'm just going to quickly, I guess I'm going to sort of make three broad points about American conservatism, theories of communitarianism. The title of our event, The Quest for Community, is, you know, in part a reference to the work of the conservative sociologist Robert Nisbet. And so I'll bring in Nisbet for the second part of what I'm talking about. And then in the third part, I'll say something more specific about where the conservative movement is today. But I think it's useful for us to think of what, for these discussions, we're calling conservative communitarianism or communitarian conservatism as kind of the dark matter of conservatism in the United States, meaning something that's crucial to holding the whole conservative project together, but that maybe is invisible to a lot of people or doesn't get sort of talked about or theorized about as much as it should. And, you know, one way to think about what we think of as modern conservatism in the US is that it's a defense of American exceptionalism. And by that, I don't mean just the sort of rah-rah, chest-thumping, America is the best country in the world kind of patriotic narrative. I mean a belief that America has some particular distinctives, a particular distinctive combination of qualities and folkways and patterns of life and governance that may not be the absolute best thing in the history of the human race, but are good and are worth defending. And those American distinctives, in many ways, you can trace them back to Alexis de Tocqueville's famous analysis of the US when he visited here in the early 19th century. But, you know, if you were going to define American exceptionalism, you would say that, you know, relative to other wealthy, developed countries, we tend to be more religious, moralistic, sometimes to a fault. We're more of a sort of commercial culture, proudly capitalist, sometimes, you know, tolerating a certain amount of, you know, artistry and hucksterism as part of our national character. And we're suspicious of state power. We're sort of natural decentralizers. We have some kind of frontier mentality that, and we're averse to the centralized states that have characterized a lot of Western Europe in the modern period. And if you take that definition, it helps explain, I think, the different factions that have ended up crowded together under the conservative tent, who sometimes don't seem to have that much ideologically in common, right? What does a Ayn Rand reading libertarian have in common with a pastor from the Bible Belt? And the answer is, on the level of worldview, maybe not all that much, but on the level of Americanness, an awful lot, right? So each faction in the conservative tent is associated with a particularly American quality. We include social and religious conservatives because America is such a religious country, or has been up till now. We include, sort of libertarians and defenders of the free market because America is it's a commercial culture. We're a nation of shopkeepers and merchants and entrepreneurs, and proudly so. And we're a small government movement, or a limited government movement, whatever that term may mean, because America is a decentralized republic with a lot of skepticism of centralized power. And all of those factions work together because they're all defending a particular idea that American exceptionalism is good and worth preserving. But the communitarian aspect of all this, I think, lurks in the background. It's part of what makes it all fit together, in the sense that it's the thread that connects the sort of libertarian spirit, the individualist, entrepreneurial side, limited government side of American conservatism, with the religious and moral and sort of social fabric oriented side of American conservatism. And I think it reflects an assumption that in the absence of sort of really strong aggressive state interventions, you can have a flourishing social fabric that does, through local organizations, churches, voluntary associations, local government, and so on, a lot of the work that people who are more on the left politically, liberals and socialists, tend to imagine that a more centralized government should do. And so you need a certain kind of communitarian bedrock, in other words, to hold the larger defense of American exceptionalism together. You need to sort of assume a community in certain ways, if you will, to make the other ideological projects really make sense. Because if you don't have that community, then you get into, I think, the modern dynamic that Robert Nisbet described in the book, which I will now hold up here. You may notice that it has an introduction by me, which I'm going to plagiarize ruthlessly for a moment, and say that Nisbet was writing in the early 1950s, and his key insight at that point, in the aftermath of the Second World War, and in a moment defined by the threat of rival totalitarian ideologies, was that you can have this terrible cycle in the modern world where rampant individualism basically dissolves community, dissolves the ties that bind people to one another. A sort of version of Karl Marx's famous line, "All that is solid melts into air." And when that happens, the human being desire for belonging, connection, and solidarity can easily swing to the opposite extreme. And instead of a society of libertarian individualists, of John Stuart Mill reading, capitalists of the mid-19th century style, you get a swing to authoritarianism and totalitarianism, and you end up with fascists, Nazis, and Marxists, Leninists, communists, and so on. And I think the implicit argument in the book is that America had escaped that sort of European swing between individualism and totalitarianism, in part because of our Tocquevillian virtues, in part because we had this sort of bedrock of community that was central to national well-being. But one of the things that Nisbet argues, I think very presciently for the time, was that this community was itself thinning out. So he has a lot of skeptical things to say about 1950s America, which seemed to have a flourishing religious culture, a flourishing culture of marriage, and so on. And he has a lot of things to say in the book that imply that this is thin and will not survive a period of dramatic social change, which turned out to be the case. And so I think you can see, in certain ways, the story of American life since then, since Nisbet wrote, from the 60s onward, as reflecting, in a way, a new version of what he was describing happening in the 19th and early 20th century, where you have various social and cultural revolutions that weaken the sort of community, the communal foundations of American life, that push people away from institutional religion, that lead to higher divorce rates and higher rates of out-of-wedlock births at first, and then eventually to a retreat from child rearing, even sex itself, which sort of characterizes our own peculiar era at the moment. So you have this sort of post-60s turn towards individualism, which then takes on sort of economic form, especially in the last 30 years, in what gets described as neoliberal economics, right? This sort of focus on deregulation and sort of removing the heavy hand of the state from the economic realm, which I think was a incredibly defensible policy from the point of view of economic growth and economic efficiency. We sort of came to it because of the stagnation of the 1970s. But it has also contributed in its own way to this culture of increased individualism. And so that's the first part of the swing. And then the second part of the swing is, I think, in part what we're actually living through an accelerated version of right now, which is a sort of turn back to community, back to ideas about solidarity, but not to the kind of Tocquevillian bedrock of family, faith, and community. But at this moment, it's much more of a turn towards identity politics, towards the solidarity of race, gender, and tribe. That is, it's sort of, I think, a confused muddle. I think if you look at where left-wing ideology is at this moment, it's much less ideologically self-conscious than were the totalitarianisms of the early 20th century, certainly. People will use the term cultural Marxism sometimes to describe where the left has ended up, but I think it's more cultural than Marxist in the sense of having more sort of cultural complexity and less theory. But wherever it is, it's, I think, clearly a response to the weakening and the collapse of other forms of community in the US, and especially, I think, of a kind of communitarian life cycle, you might say, that people used to be accustomed to entering into, where, you were sort of part of an embedded community as a kid. You might go away for school, but you would expect to sort of return to a community in some sense. And you had sort of expectations of marriage and family formation as things that happened relatively early in your life, maybe not by age 22, but certainly by age 30, that then set the sort of re-embedded you for middle age and life thereafter, which I'm currently looking forward to. And that sort of ladder of community, where you leave one community, you leave your familial community, but you enter into another, that seems to be breaking down in all kinds of ways. And young people in their 20s and 30s don't have those kind of expectations for community formation. And so they're looking for other forms of solidarity and finding them on the political left. So quickly, what is the conservative response to this? And I think the conservative response has exhibited a kind of cycle of its own, where you go through periods where there's a conservative expectation that if you just sort of get government out of the way, basically remove the state from all the myriad interventions that it makes in American life, either there will be sort of this remaining bedrock of sort of community self-sufficiency that can then sort of build on itself and take the place of a flailing bureaucratic state. Or maybe that bedrock isn't there, but there's at least some sort of soil beneath the bedrock that I'm mixing metaphors, I apologize, but that can, that again, with state power removed, has the capacity to sort of generate green shoots and eventually generate the whole thicket of associational life that conservatives support. So that's one theory, and it's more associated, I think, with the libertarian aspects of conservatism. But what often has happened is that either that theory hasn't worked, or it's proven really difficult to get rid of the actual government bureaucracies that have been sort of entrenched in our national life for going on a century now. And so then you get a different conservative move, which is to say, look, we're going to use government power in a more pro-communitarian direction, basically. And so this is what you get from George H.W. Bush's 1,000 Points of Light. It's what you get from his son's compassionate conservatism. And in a peculiar way, it's what you got from Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, where a big part of the narrative was basically saying that Tea Party era conservatism had been too libertarian, and we needed sort of government power to bring back the jobs, basically, that in Trump's conception were essential to the bedrock of that communitarian bedrock. You can't have the bedrock without good paying jobs. Trump was going to bring back the jobs, or he was going to hire people to build the highways and all of this stuff. And I think now we're at a moment where basically there's just a lot of conservative uncertainty, because for 50 years, I think we've sort of swung back and forth between the more libertarian perspective and the more pro-government perspective, without either of them really effectively changing the gradual erosion of Tocquevillian America, which is, if anything, accelerated over the last 10 years. And we've just had a presidency that in theory was committed to the pro-government conservatism, but in practice was, a sort of ineffective reality show. And I'm speaking of it in the past tense, even though obviously Donald Trump is still very much the president. But I think it's clear that if there is a second Trump term, what will matter in that term is the fight over the future of conservatism that takes place outside the Trump administration, not any sweeping policy agenda that he enacts. So I think we can get into more where conservatism might go from here, but I'll just leave off there by suggesting that, the big story of American life over the last 50 years is a sort of, in fits and starts, a pretty steady erosion of the communitarian bedrock that undergirds conservative theories of what America should be. And the conservative movement, while it has this communitarian thread running through it, has not really figured out a consistent way to operationalize those ideas in policy. And, it certainly needs such a theory if the trend of the last 50 years is going to change over the next 50. So I'll stop there.
Great, Ross. Thanks very much for setting the table for this conversation. I note that in the Washington Examiner today, there's an interview with Ted Cruz, who declares that the future of conservatism is libertarian and populist. And so I take your point about the bedrock term, which is a term used, the bedrock of communitarianism is something both essential to recognize, but important to actualize. So again, I want to be clear about the intent and import of this particular webinar in the series, is that we are going to be looking at issues of politics and political philosophy. Future webinars in this series are going to be taking more explicit looks at policy implications of communitarianism. But at the same time, I think it's important that we talk about its current place, as you've just done. Gracie, your response.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's a true honor to get to be a part of this discussion, one which has been much on my heart and mind, I would say, over the last several years, because in large part, I've been spending a great deal of time studying the past and present of the Idaho community where I grew up. And as I've worked on that project, I saw the patterns of both individualism and decay and of membership that Nisbet has talked about, which I think Rosso excellently pointed out, that there are these folkways that are good, that kind of have responded to and perhaps stemmed some of the collapse of community that we've seen across our country. I would say that dependability of people and places and things historically served as the bedrock of this and many other communities in America. It was a community of deep roots somehow, despite the fact that entrenched individualism and burgeoning economic concentration in particular seemed to threaten those threads on many sides. I think this stability and rootedness was largely a result of the mediating institutions and associations which both Nisbet and Alexis de Tocqueville saw as integral to healthy community, the forms of social capitalism which fostered fidelity and stability and purpose within the larger society. And I've thought a lot about how my great-grandparents demonstrated this over the course of their own lives. When they first got married, it was the beginning of the Great Depression and they had less than $5 to start their life on. But local neighbors and relatives gave them spices so that they would have something to cook with, teams of horses, free lumber, hay, 5 head of milk cows, among other things. And thanks to the support they received, thanks to the social fabric they were integrated into, they made a wonderful life for themselves. As they grew older, they were very deliberate about extending the same sort of service and stewardship to the other people around them. They organized church functions, visited folks at local nursing homes, volunteered with multiple local boards. And I see in their lives the ways in which connected, community-oriented systems of giving and supporting, helping people in their time of need was extended to following generations. Now, I think in our time, the left often argues that the state should serve as the primary source of aid and support for individuals, such as my great-grandparents, whereas the right often espouses a libertarianism and self-reliance that would have all such individuals pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But Nisbet argues that these seemingly variant viewpoints are perhaps more connected than we think, and that both serve to erode the communal connectedness and support once experienced by people within these communities. My grandparents, as well as others within a lot of historical American communities, were part of functionally significant and psychologically meaningful, to use Nisbet's words, forms of groups and associations. And these lay intermediate to the individual and the larger values and purposes of society that they needed. These groups and associations offered meaning and roots and tempered individualism with a strong cultural heritage of membership. But we see in the quest for community that there is this threat always, that liberalism's emphasis on the discrete individual, autonomous and self-sufficing, along with the encroaching nature of the state, will war with these communities and weaken their thick social fabric. So Western culture, I believe, has for centuries uprooted its inhabitants, breaking down local ties and replacing them with a deepening reliance on the state. And this is observable today in my rural homeland, where both economic and cultural autonomy have been on the wane for many, many years. Nisbet suggested that the modern individual now has no culture to lean on, except a mass society that manipulates him. And to combat this, he argued he needs to attach himself somewhere. But I believe most of us have observed that fidelity to place or to a social group, be it a family, a church, or a neighborhood, is hardly popular in modern American life. As Ross pointed out, we are very much wedded to individualism and to the idea that we should have increasingly limitless amounts of choices, and that mobility should be our mode of life as opposed to rootedness. In our own time, many are seeking new forms of collectivism, I think, in large national movements, as Ross pointed out. That identity is often formed around various groups or tribes that we might associate with race or other things, whereas in a historic perspective, what you see in Nisbet's work is much more of an idea that we can be wedded to place and to the very diverse and pluralistic groups of people within that place. But what we are seeing is that the collective movements of our time are polarizing and schismatic, and they atomize the individual further by carrying with them few opportunities to bind together an increasingly fractured country, or to ground many of today's complaints or difficulties in a place in which we might put forth practical ways of serving community. So both parties seek answers to our political discontent in national solutions or solidarity, but partisanship has deeply alienated classes, social groups, and communities from any sort of meaningful or civil dialogue. And I think if Nisbet is right, these troubles are rooted in a moral crisis as well as a political one which is deeply connected to our loss of community and its underlying purpose and structure. Nisbet argued in the 1950s that we were living through a time of moral and spiritual chaos, of certainties abandoned, creeds outworn, and values devalued. And I think these words are certainly just as true, if not more applicable today. Michael Hanvey recently wrote for The Lamp magazine that one cannot solve a humanistic crisis by technological and political means, and politics cannot cure the sickness of mind and spirit that has infected us. So while I'm hopeful that conservatives can indeed put together a set of policy solutions which will further the binding together of community, of repairing the bedrock that maybe we've lost, I don't think we can consider our loss of moral certainty or membership without acknowledging the social fabric that gave it once moral and functional meaning to the life of the individual, and the fact that that was indeed a spiritual as well as a political reality. The cure to our nihilism cannot be considered apart from the reanimation of moral coherence along with communal membership. And so I believe Nisbet still offers us inspiration and would likely urge us to rekindle our bonds of fidelity to kin, neighborhood, church, and community. But his work urges us not to reactionary nostalgia and to insist upon reliving or reanimating something that is in fact decades in the past, but to the vital work of reform and renewal of what we have. And so I think whatever we cultivate now within our memberships in terms of our own personal lives can help build back something of a foundation for tomorrow's growth or decline, and help build health or lack that our children and grandchildren will live on. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Gracie. Great response, and very excited now to get into this conversation. I see some great questions coming in via the chat feature. And again, I welcome you all to enter your questions through the chat, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Just a time check. We are looking to go to 1:15 Eastern time. And so we've got some great time here to explore the table that you have both set. And so, Ross, I want to begin with you and discuss this question about the relevancy of this communitarian conservatism to today's politics and especially the political movement. There's obviously a philosophical history and movement that is American conservatism, but there's also a political movement. And so I want to see if we can find a way to bridge those through a quotation in that ISI edition of Quest for Community, which I heartily recommend if you don't have that particular edition, that you pick that one up that has Ross's introduction. You wrote in that introduction, quote, "This is the problem that the right has confronted not only in the Bush era, but across the past 3 decades, and it hasn't been resolved yet. Once the bonds of community have frayed, is it enough to merely withdraw the power of the state and watch communities reknit themselves?" Unquote. So in other words, how does a communitarian conservatism, which I know for my libertarian friends gets swept into this discussion of so-called big government conservatism, how does it speak to a political movement which has often been framed as either anti-government on one side or being big government on the other?
Well, I wrote that introduction a while ago, but the question hasn't gotten any easier to answer since, I would say. I think the answer to the question, the specific question, is no. It's clearly not enough to just have state power out of the way for communities that have fallen into, the sort of state of atomization and collapse that Gracie is describing, just reknit themselves. And instead, what often seems to happen is a kind of ghastly parody of rootedness. So, one of the striking things about American life in the last 25 years is that actually mobility has decreased in America. So in fact, we think of the late modern world as this time when everybody's leaving home and never coming back and so on. And that's true of very well-educated Americans who are sort of clustering, or have clustered more and more, at least pre-pandemic, in sort of these wealthy urban enclaves along the coasts and in various places around the country. But for working class Americans, they're actually less likely to move than they used to be. They're less likely to pick up and go to a new state looking for work and so on. But that hasn't produced a sort of flourishing communities in these places where people aren't leaving. Instead, it's created a sort of a sort of stagnation and decay, basically, with the opioid epidemic as sort of the sort of darkest timeline paradigm, right? Where, you know, you have basically post-industrial communities where people aren't leaving, but they also aren't having kids or starting businesses or starting families or going to church. They're taking drugs. And that's, you know, it's a generalization, but it's a generalization that describes a sort of increasing reality that's also associated with increasing rates of suicide and everything that gets bundled into the category of deaths of despair. So when you look at that dynamic, you would say, well, something else has to change, basically. It can't just be a sort of you can't just have a kind of leave us alone conservatism as an answer to that reality. But the question of what the actual response should be is really hard, or rather, it's partially clear what the response should be, but it's one that requires a certain kind of, you know, moral and cultural renewal that can't just be wished into being, right? So in effect, large parts of America are in need of what you might call missionary efforts right now, and that includes religious missionary efforts, but it's I think you can use the term more broadly to a kind of, you know, they're in need of people to literally go to them and sort of carry some of their social capital into those communities and become the leaders and organizers and, you know, doctors and ministers and, you know, just effectively play crucial roles that are absent from those communities right now. And some of that can only come about one individual choice at a time. And some of it can only come about through sort of collective efforts that government can't create. Government can't wish a great awakening into being, obviously. So to some extent, there's an aspect of communitarian conservatism that just has to be about figuring out how you get talented and capable people to sort of take on voluntary roles in moral renewal around the country. But then at the same time, you also need some sort of policy vision from the center, right? Because if the center is as powerful as we all agree it is, then the choices made in New York and Washington, D.C. matter a great deal. And you do have to have serious thinking about, you know, well, to what extent is this hollowing out an economic as well as a social problem, right? To what extent does it reflect our trade policies and our industrial policy and all, you know, things that have basically removed the economic incentives for talented people to live in those communities, remove the economic supports for people to make a living in those communities. And that's, I think, the question that, again, as I said at the outset, sort of hangs unresolved over the Trump era, because Donald Trump sort of campaigned in 2016 offering some version of that argument, literally going around the country and giving speeches in these sort of zones of stagnation and despair. But it hasn't cashed out in any kind of sort of clear, decisive agenda. And, you know, the libertarian critique of government, you know, applies to these kinds of efforts as much as it applies to more socialist alternatives, right? Like if you look at, if you look at the George W. Bush era, a lot of things George W. Bush tried to do were trying to be responsive to this problem. And some of them did some good, and some of them, like marriage promotion efforts, had very ambiguous results. And some things like the push for an ownership society where everyone is owning their own home contributed to the mortgage bubble and the financial collapse. So, you know, I think it's simultaneously the case that libertarianism is not enough, but also the case that the libertarian skepticism about, well, good-intentioned government efforts is going to apply to communitarian policymaking as much as to anything else.
Very good. Gracie, I want to stay on this theme about political rhetoric and how conservatism is understood and how possibly a more communitarian view may respond and attract more adherents. You penned a piece recently in the American Conservatism on American identity. And you write, in times of crisis, as Tocqueville wrote, we can display both positive and negative qualities in these seasons. communitarian conservatism is sometimes set against national conservatism, though there is a genuinely American quality to that communitarianism. And I see a couple of really good questions that are coming in via the chat feature regarding this. It's not really a debate, but maybe a questioning about national conservatism as a movement, which is seen, I think, by some as being very exclusionary, maybe in some corners very ethnically driven or religiously driven. At the same time, this communitarian conservatism has always been framed as part of the American identity, as something that is at times, certainly through Tocqueville's writing and others, uniquely American. So I wonder if you could square these two things about national conservatism and its efforts to describe and outline American identity, and how a communitarian conservatism may be doing some of the same thing.
Well, first to those positive and negative qualities, Tocqueville was identifying when he wrote in America that there was this healthy voluntarism and desire to associate and to serve in local communities that he saw as some of our greatest virtues, and that it would help to perpetually bring men together despite the fact that individualism and oftentimes the power of the state, amongst other things, would threaten to sever us. But it's interesting because I was rereading over The Quest for Community and discovered that Nisbet suggests in one of his chapters that nationalism was in fact the child of the French Revolution, because the nation in his mind is not the natural outgrowth of the family or the tribe, but it is in fact the offspring of the state. And so he believed that nationalism could not be understood apart from the fissures in the traditional structure of human loyalties that result from the encroaching power of the state, and was very concerned with any movement that would set up nation as the source of identity, as opposed to the social groups, which are in fact more local and proximate to human beings. Our own nation state, I think, has eroded many of those institutional bonds over time that Tocqueville saw as the positive sources of cohesion and virtue, and the ones that would truly manifest themselves as being the most helpful in times of crisis. So for some of these reasons, I think I'm cautious of a nationalist project, these reasons and others, but the reason being we need to consider its roots and what it replaces. But I think the counterpoint, and this gets at something that I think Ross is also identifying when we talk about how do we combat the disillusion of those institutions, and the fact that we can't just expect to pull away the power of the state and for things to regenerate themselves, is that we're not just facing the monolithic power of the state in our time, but in many places and instances, the monolithic power of global corporations, which have disempowered many local communities and regional entities. And I think it's likely impossible for a small town or association to go up against the DuPonts of the world without some sort of larger governmental power behind them. And so because we've eroded things and we have this incredible economic consolidation and monopolization in our time, I think we will likely need a set of coherent national programs that aim to shore up and protect the community and the individual. But I do like how Patrick Deneen has put it in the past. He's argued that the nation should be embraced as the necessary political unit only insofar as it's supporting those aspects of our lives that need conserving, including the family, the community, the neighborhood, the marginalized, and more. The irony, of course, as Deneen points out, is that in this effort, we will be seeking the assistance of the state to correct many of the problems that the state itself created.
Mm. No, Gracie, I think that's a good point. And I have many friends in the NatCon camp. I think some of them actually are chiming in here with some good questions we're going to be getting to. I think they speak to something that is fundamental and important, which is to say that in a time of globalization, and certainly from the left, this concept of being citizens of the world, that our national identity is unique and important. What I find sometimes is the challenge is when we don't go to that second level question, which is to say, then what is our national identity? And I see that as a place where this communitarian conservatism and national conservatism actually come together, in the sense that what makes America great has been this communitarian, very humane understanding of how we build communities and build our politics, as opposed to other ways in which we could define our national community, which could be in ways both ethnic and religious. That's not to say that those elements are not a part of our history, and in some cases operative, but certainly I don't think, especially in an age of such incredible diversity in our country, I still see communitarianism as being uniquely relevant to this time, because from what I see for the ethnic groups that are growing here in the United States, they are very communitarian by their own nature. We certainly see that here in California. And so I see that connection as well. Ross, I want to come back to you. In that introduction you wrote to the ISI edition of Quest, you quote from Nisbet himself and his essay in 1993, which was the 40th anniversary of Quest for Community. And he wrote an essay titled Still Questing. And I wanted to pull a quote from that and get your thought on it. He said, "Let me repeat and conclude here that a conservative party or other group has a double task confronting it. The first is to work tirelessly toward the diminution of the centralized, omnicompetent, and unitary state with its ever-soaring debt and deficit. The second, and equally important task, is that of protecting, reinforcing, nurturing where necessary, the various groups that form the true building blocks of the social order. To these two ends, I am bound to believe in the continuing relevance of the quest for community." And so in some ways, we've segued exactly from what Gracie has just outlined. But I wonder if you think what a reimagined communitarian conservatism might look like in this politically polarized era.
So I think I'll try and pick up from what Gracie was saying about this, the role of the nation, because I think that's one way to look at it is there's sort of a choice between whether we should think of America, a country of 330 odd million people, as a nation or as an empire, and that would have different implications for the philosophical and the policy posture of conservatism, right? So if you think of America primarily as a nation, then what we are in search of is, in a sense, a refashioned national narrative and a new sense of national identity, right? So we're looking for a kind of new version of the post-World War II moment, when we were able to sort of bind together the narratives of a lot of different immigrant groups who had been in tension with the kind of Anglo-Protestant culture of early 19th century America, and create a kind of a vision of the American way of life that I think, provided a kind of script and a sort of shared sense of identity and belonging that was pretty important to post-war America. That narrative doesn't work anymore because, as you just said, Pete, America is much more diverse in many ways than it was in the 40s and 50s, more ethnically diverse, more religiously diverse, more sociologically diverse. And because there are legitimate claims made by, above all, African Americans, also Native Americans, about the extent to which that post-war narrative sort of excluded them and their stories from the national story. So you could say, look, what we need, therefore, is a new refashioning, a new narrative that figures out a way to celebrate the founding and also put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill, right? To make a very crude sort of symbolic version that says, all right, here's how we are more fully integrating the African American experience and other minority experiences into the national story. Here's how we're going to have some kind of narrative of American spiritual values that doesn't feel either exclusionary on the one hand or post-Christian on the other hand. And you need to find a leader who is, let's say, like a Charles de Gaulle in post-World War II France, who can sort of maybe come from the political right, but sort of cast himself as the champion of, in that case, a Frenchness that encompassed Republicans and monarchists, socialists and conservatives, and creates a kind of, at least temporarily, a new national master narrative. So that's one theory. The other theory is that that's just impossible, right? That we're now too big and too diverse to have that kind of nationalist narrative anymore, in which case we need to think of ourselves more as a kind of polyglot imperium that, you know, is a little bit like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a little bit like the Roman Empire, and basically decentralizes its narratives, right? And says, look, you're going to have, you know, a central government that recognizes an evangelical Christian narrative of American history and recognizes an African American narrative of American history, and lets those groups sort of form their state level or regional level communities, leaves them maybe more freedom than they have right now to form sort of communal oriented micropolities, and tries to sort of superintend over all of this. And I think you can see hints of this in the kind of, you know, like Neil Gorsuch's jurisprudence right now, right? Where, you know, one day he's declaring a sort of, you know, national rules of non-discrimination around for gay and transgender Americans. And the next day he's declaring religious exceptions potentially to these rules that in theory allow religious groups to sort of set up their own zones that aren't sort of micromanaged by the centralized state. And the next day he's declaring that the Creek Indians still own half of eastern Oklahoma, right? Which is like a literalization of a sort of micropolity vision of America. And so you could imagine a kind of, you know, a future America where, you know, going from, you know, the Mormon West to California to the secularized Northeast to the evangelical South actually creates more cultural shocks because each of those regions have developed in their own direction. But I think those are two very different conceptions of what a diverse America needs right now. And I've written columns in favor of both of them. So I'm obviously not sure what the answer is.
Well, and I wondered too, you know, we got some questions coming in. I see my man Ovik Roy with Jeff Cabot Service holding forth on what is the critique of communitarianism, which goes to your point, Ross, that isn't this just a nostalgia for 1830s America? I would respond, at least initially, to those who think that with a study by Robert Putnam that he released in 2006 called E Pluribus Unum, which that phrase, by the way, to me is foundational to both American identity and this way in which we can have community freedom, so to speak, and identity and cohesion around those things, understanding that we are part of an unum at the same time. But to go to Putnam's study, what Putnam found in that study, he researched 40 of the largest cities in America and explored their levels of what he called civic trust and civic engagement in each one of those 40 municipalities or metropolitan areas. And he was looking at everything on surveys from, would you be willing to help your neighbor? Do you know who your neighbor is? Have you ever gone to a local community meeting or city council meeting? And across an array of different questions, he landed upon a rather unfashionable conclusion, which was an inverse relationship in these cities between ethnic diversity and what he called civic trust. In other words, the highest levels where a city had a high level of ethnic diversity, it had a very low level of civic trust. And I thought about that study recently because the city of the 40 he examined, which had the highest level of ethnic diversity and the lowest level of civic trust, was Minneapolis, Minnesota. The other two in the top three were Los Angeles and San Francisco. Now, what was interesting about that study, and you could see that Putnam was at pains at describing something that was finding it difficult to describe that we actually were living in an unum amidst our pluribus, was that there were two places, two institutions across the country and across these 40 cities, even the ones that had low levels of civic trust. There were two institutions in which he found high levels of civic trust as well as high levels of ethnic diversity. And those were in Protestant megachurches and large Catholic churches. And so, Gracie, I want to come to you then. I wonder if it's a very understandable and I think a credible critique of communitarian conservatism that this is about returning to an age of homogenous groups racially. But I wonder if this way of conceiving of our policy and politics can be understood apart from some form of religious commitment that understands that we are the imago Dei as individuals, whatever our race, and that can be a foundation, as Putnam found, for finding high levels of ethnic diversity, but also ethnic or civic trust.
Yeah, such an important question. I think Nisbet, to some extent, does address this question of whether this is nostalgia in his work, and is very vehement about the fact that he doesn't want us to return to something that existed in a medieval era or any other era after, but that he is wanting us to take what's been broken down and to find new forms of association to replace what has been lost. I think he's also very honest and correct in pointing out that in many instances, what we are looking at and the problems we face are not some sort of battle against, good and evil, where individualism itself is all bad, but that there are goods that individualism and progress and innovation have presented us with, and that there are some goods we've lost through the breakdown of community and church and kinship. But in every case, he points to the importance of pluralism and diversity in making these things a reality. The point is never to build sort of tribalistic communities in which there's a very unhealthy, racially focused sort of parochialism, but that in the realm of the local, you have the ability to exercise those virtues which promote the dignity of human beings, which serve them in their needs, and which make perhaps an avenue forward for healing that we don't always see immediately on the national level. I think we do have an extremely broken history when it comes to advancing the well-being of all citizens, and that marginalization and systemic racism are going to have to be dealt with thoroughly in our own time. That has to be a program that is not just communitarian in nature, but that is also national in nature, because it has to deal with the inherent brokenness of institutions and systems that have existed for generations. But I think one thing that Nisbet also points out is that we have tended to be a very forgetful people, that oftentimes our individualism and the nature of our politics encourages us to forget even very recent history. And what I find very interesting about our own moment is that we're all being encouraged to remember and to have a very, very focused gaze, not just on the present, but on a very broken past, and to carry the lessons of that past into the present and future. And I think that's something that Nisbet and Tocqueville would both call us to in terms of how we address the problems that we're seeing today.
Thank you for that. Ross, I want to come back to you because as I'm thinking through this conversation, I want to get back to your remarks about identity politics. We make note, I mentioned before, that this Quest for Community series is part of an initiative here at Pepperdine's Graduate Policy School called the American Project. And unique to academia, we actually take conservatism seriously here and affectionately. But one of the points that we make in this principles document that we wrote back in 2017 was that making the essential case that nature abhors a vacuum, right? Where there isn't a sense of affiliation, whether it's at the geographic level, right, with a local community or state or nation. It is human nature to find that affiliation in other places. And especially as it pertains to these, the good questions that are being raised about, isn't communitarianism just a longing for homogenous communities? Is it fair to say that what we're seeing in so much of the identity politics, predominantly from the left, but also from the right, is in and of itself a quest for community by those, maybe some, who did not feel that sense of welcoming or connection, that they are in fact expressing something very human, which is, I think, at the foundational root of communitarian conservatism, that is essentially a very humane, if not human, way of looking at our politics. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit to this current political climate and the identity politics that we seem so polarized by, and whether that in and of itself is a sort of quest for community.
Yeah, I mean, I think it absolutely is. And I think you could sort of maybe usefully break it into three parts, and just starting on the right. I mean, I think, what sometimes gets called white identity politics, which is sort of an identity politics of nostalgia, is a yearning for a more homogenous or homogenous seeming America. That doesn't mean that it's per se bad, because many of the things that it's yearning for were actually good. If you're yearning for a world where you can support a family of 3 kids on a steady union job and live near your parents in a prosperous mid-sized American city, like, that's not a bad nostalgia. Those are good things. Where it turns toxic is when it just, where the aspect of that's nostalgic for an economy that excluded African Americans becomes the primary thing, and the growing diversification of America is just sort of blamed for all of the losses that a lot of middle and working class Americans, feel they've faced over the last few generations. So there's, you have to somehow sift the appropriate nostalgia from the toxic nostalgia, and that's obviously a difficult thing to do. Then at the same time, you have the non-nostalgic version, right, which is the feeling of Black Americans that they were never fully integrated into either local or national communities. That, they had their own communities that were very deliberately excluded from sort of certain civic goods, even after slavery, to some extent, even post-segregation. And so there's a claim there that's not nostalgic in the least. That's just sort of a basic complaint against America, that we sort of successfully went through cycles of diversification and inclusion that brought immigrant populations more fully into the national fold, and never did the same fully with the descendants of American slaves. So there's a claim there. And then finally, there's what I was, I think, gesturing to earlier, which is what you might call the sort of the disappointments of diverse, but mostly white, upper middle class Americans who were raised by baby boomer parents in the aftermath of the cultural revolutions of the 1960s, and were sort of given, I would say, a kind of kind of weakened but still real communitarianism, where you were sort of told, all right, your community is the meritocracy, right? And you're supposed to play by a certain set of rules. And, you know, we're not going to be particularly religious anymore. We're not going to be hyper moralistic, but, you know, don't get pregnant while you're in college because, you know, you've got professional prospects ahead of you. Follow this sort of success sequence where you work insanely hard in high school and get into a good college and have a good job waiting for you and have 2 kids by the time you're 35 and everything will work out, right? And I think that was sort of the community I was raised in. Mm-hmm. Not in my family, we were weird eccentrics, but like the world around me of the 1990s, right, had that perspective. You know, your community was your good public school or prep school, followed by your college. I think a part of the appeal of the Harry Potter books to that cohort was like school community, right? Like where you got in, that was going to be your community and your identity. And then I think a combination of economic crises that made it harder for people in that cohort to get jobs, joined to various communal breakdowns, the reality that like cramming courtship and marriage and childbearing into like 4 years between age 32 and 37 doesn't actually work that well, joined to the effects of the internet on social life and dating. All of that, I think, has made that community sort of dissolve. And so a lot of young people who are not part of an oppressed minority, technically, who are really sort of part of the, you know, what should be the privileged upper middle class, just feel totally adrift right now. Mm. And I think you see that on college campuses, and mm-hmm. obviously the pandemic has only made that worse. So that's a long ramble, but I think all 3 of those different things are going on in identity politics right now.
Yeah, and Ross, just to put a finer point on it, one of the arguments that we make in this A Way Forward document that defines what my co-director in this American project, Rich Taffel, has dubbed the conservatism of connection, is that it is necessary to respond to something. And that something are these incredible levels, whether through surveys across disciplines, economics, political science, health, have all been talking about these heightened levels of alienation and, frankly, loneliness. Now, that is something that Nisbet begins the quest for community with, and he published that back in 1953, so it could be argued, has anything really changed? But I think it is fair to say that what we're seeing today, whether it's the deaths of despair and the research by Angus Deaton and Ann Case, or the work that's been done otherwise around loneliness and the health impacts, or the work that's been done on the impact of social media, especially on the young and increasing levels of loneliness, that the argument that we're making here through the American Project and through webinars like this is that this communitarian view of conservatism is one that can attract people from across political perspectives, but at the same time can respond to this moment that we're in that is being refracted through our politics. But it starts really, as Nisbet did. He was a sociologist, right? So he was making a comment on culture, that this is responding to a cultural moment that we're in. So we're up here against the last few minutes, and so again, I just wanted to remind you all that this is the first in a webinar series, The Quest for Community. Our next one is being scheduled, looks to be in the next couple weeks. I know that we're going to be welcoming Christopher Caldwell and Heather McDonald to join one of our faculty members, Dr. Ted McAllister, in a conversation about how we got here, how the conservative movement came to this place. That'll be in the next couple weeks. We're going to take August off, and then we're going to come back in September and October with another set of conversations around this Quest for Community theme. We're going to be looking at issues of race, around public policy more specifically, and around the future of our politics. If this link was passed along to you and you'd like to be on the email list for those future webinars, just simply respond to the email that you'll be getting from us with a link to this session. I'm delighted to hear that C-SPAN is going to be taking this recorded webinar series and broadcasting it at a later date, and we'll make sure to let you all know. We certainly welcome you sharing the link to this recorded session as we build this American project. And again, if you'd like to know more about the American project, just simply go to publicpolicy.pepperdine.edu and then scroll down to our programs, and you'll see the link to the American project, where you'll see not only our past events, but also the writings that go under our channel at Real Clear Policy. I want to conclude with, on a high note in these last 5 minutes, just in this conversation. Gracie, I'm going to come to you first. You know, you've got a book coming out in March of next year in which you talk about these issues of place, which I think are so much a part of this communitarian conservatism. The fact that it grounds our communities geographically as opposed to racially or in other ways. And so wondered if you could talk a little bit about what makes you optimistic about the prospects for a communitarian conservatism in the months and years ahead.
I think there is sources for optimism in even this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, when everyone has been sequestered away trying to protect people that they know and love, their larger communities. One thing that I noticed over the course of the last several months is that as our sphere of movement shrunk, there was a huge response from individuals who pressed into their neighborhoods, their families, and their churches. And I saw a huge outpouring from the local church in providing for local needs, whether it was toilet paper, diapers, groceries. There was a sense in which this constant narrowing of our vision back to the ground in which we were standing on pushed people to care for those nearest them. Neighbors bartering goods was another kind of funny example that happened during that time. But my hope is that a lot of that reinvigoration of place and turning our eyes toward the needs of our place, the people who perhaps now are jobless or who are in a position where they are still immunocompromised and have to be careful, that we will address those needs and that we will begin to see perhaps a little more clearly things that are easy to ignore when you are commuting full-time, busy with multiple jobs, driving your kids to events. And I think perhaps that in this time, a lot of Americans are realizing what's broken and have a deep desire to fix it, whether that's needs within their local community or the brokenness of larger systems that need fixing. The outbreak of deaths in slaughterhouses was another example of Americans realizing for the first time that perhaps there are these systems they rely upon and take for granted that need reform in our own age. And so I'm very eager to see how people press into their own neighborhoods, their own communities, and seek to begin the work of rebuilding them. And that is difficult to do in a time of social distancing, but I think what I've seen locally is that it is not at all impossible, and that there are going to be opportunities going forward to keep that work going.
Thank you very much, Gracie. Very well said. And we look forward to continuing this conversation with you. Ross, let's conclude with you. Are there things that you see as being uniquely relevant to this view of conservatism today? Are there things that, even after writing the book, The Decadent Society, that make you at all optimistic about the chances that this view and set of principles might be more widely understood and adopted in the months and years ahead?
I mean, I guess I would just associate myself with what Gracie said and say, first, that I think we've seen many catastrophic failures in the US over the last few months, but strikingly, the failures have been worst in government and sort of in structures, and they've been much less evident among the American people. I think the fact that we were able to go through a months-long period of lockdown that was unfortunately in certain ways wasted by our policymakers speaks to at least a residual American willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. And as Gracie said, to do the kind of community-oriented things, including the people, the families who, you know, brought food for my wife and I after we had a baby in the midst of all this madness. So I think it suggests that, you know, the pandemic has exposed a million failures and a million signs of decadence, but has also suggested that there is some resilience to Tocquevillian America as well. And if I'm being hopeful, I would say that the extent to which people have been sort of forced onto Zoom and sort of forced deeper into the internet and deeper into virtual substitutes for reality over the last few months will produce a kind of backlash where once this period is over, everyone will be very excited about getting back to reality. And I think community lives best in reality, that the internet works as a kind of supplement to community, but is potentially devastating when it replaces it. So to the extent that such a backlash, I think it'd be a good sign. And, you know, finally, I mean, I'm encouraged that Gracie has a book coming out next year, which will provide a justification for you to invite us to the actual campus of your actual school. And, you know, we can conduct it on a tent and a beach. And I just want to commit from you, Pete, to have that conversation in the flesh in the future.
You have that commitment from me.
Excellent.
I look forward to welcoming you all to this very unique community in Malibu, California. I guess I will close relevant to that. My 8-year-old daughter, Elsa, just commented in the midst of just being very tired of communicating with friends through technology. She said, I can't wait for this COVID thing to be over. We are going to have some party. And that party is really a community. It's a community gathering. And so I agree with you, Ross, that in many ways, for both you and Gracie, you've shown that this crisis has both elicited the importance of community and responding to the needs of our neighbors, while at the same time demonstrating and eliciting our own longing to be together. We're experiencing that as we plan for a fall semester where some students are going to be remote. I miss our students. And so you have that pledge from me that we are all going to gather here next spring in person here in Malibu. So with that, thank you, Ross, so much. Thank you, Gracie, very much. And thank you all for joining this first in our Quest for Community webinar series. Again, if you'd like to know more about the American Project, just click over to publicpolicy.pepperdine.edu. As a graduate policy school that was founded by the likes of Jack Kemp, Michael Novak, and James Q. Wilson, we take the moral sense here very seriously, and these issues around the things that are sometimes difficult to measure, but are nonetheless operative in our politics and policy, we take very seriously. So if you'd like to join in on that conversation, we look forward to being with you again in the next couple of weeks for the next in this series. And again, look forward to seeing you then online. We want to thank our funders and supporters, namely the Sarah Scaife Foundation, also Democracy Fund, as well as Gary Oakland, one of our supporters here at Pepperdine School of Public Policy, for making today possible, and the webinars and the American Project as it continues on to promote and extol this communitarian version of conservatism. So until next time, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.